I learned this from Julian's interview, that because Julian goes very in depth about like people's personal lives and like and things like that and how they became the way they are, and that's really cool. Like that's really cool that he does that. And I remember when he did the interview with Analyzing Evil, or Violi, or Jamal, whichever name we're gonna call him. Jamal was actually the son of like a nightclub owner, gangster, wannabe type of guy. I don't know, just seeing evil growing up and seeing like evil in the world. Like he's like, all right. I think that was partly why he did it, but he also said that it was because it was to promote a book originally. That's why he started the channel. Mm-hmm. But pain, and the way that people interpret pain is a very interesting way of making art, because some people take pain and they use it as an excuse not to work. Other people use pain as nothing but motivation to work.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. I was a guest on this man's show, I'd say about a month or so ago, and I really enjoyed it. I offered him to come on mine because we talked a little bit about off air and some of the guests that he's had on. Please welcome George Peyrouton. Is that it?
I mean, you could say Peyrouton. You're right either way. But yeah, that's my name.
All right. Well, George, welcome to Crime and Entertainment, my friend. Glad to have you.
Well, I'm glad that I had you on my show as well.
Well, thank you. So just out of curiosity, how did you spot me?
I watched an interview with you and Danny Jones. Funny enough, I was doing some guest searching, and then I'm like, this guy, I'll talk to this guy. And, here we are now.
Nice. Isn't that cool how this podcast game works when you can see interviews with people, and now with the advent of Instagram, social media, you can reach out and message and essentially set up an interview kind of like you did. You didn't know me from Adam. You seen me on Danny's podcast. It had a link to, I think, my show. You tracked me down that way. And I think it makes it so easier for people that want to get into this game and get into podcasting. Whereas before, like, I don't know how you really got guests before all this stuff was over. Like Joe Rogan was doing this kind of stuff way before social media. So you just had to know the people. Like without social media and without Instagram, I don't know if I could have ever started my channel.
Well, there's also emails too. And also too, I mean, Instagram and Facebook has been a thing for a while now. So I'm sure Joe Rogan probably had Facebook, because when did he start his show? He started his show like 11 years ago. So
yeah, he's been doing it for a while. I think, like, I remember seeing somebody posted a picture and it was like how long Joe Rogan's been doing podcasts. And I don't know if it had a year, but it was just like a table and a shitload of wires and a laptop. I mean, it was very like a modern day podcast, I guess.
Well, if you look at the first episode with him and Brian Redban, who, he's a comedian, for any of you who are wondering. The first episode is with him and his buddy Brian Redban, and that was who the show was supposed to be about. It was just supposed to be him and his buddy, and they just talk about stuff. Mm-hmm. And, if you watch those first two episodes, it's just them at a computer screen, just talking. Yeah. That's all it is. It's not even like they're not even at a table yet. But then, like, the first 100 episodes, like, later on, he does start getting other guests, because there's only so much you talk about with your friends on a show. Right. And so they start bringing other guys on. And, then he brings on Joey Diaz, and he brings on all these other guys. And that's how he got started, basically. But, yeah.
Joey Diaz is funny. Like, that is a funny dude. And, I see where a lot of people probably find him crude, but I've always just been one of them guys. The cruder, to me, the more funnier you are. And that dude is, I mean, he's hilarious, but it's because I think he's real. He's so real. Like, not all his stories, these outlandish, crazy stories about with strippers and hookers and robbing people in prison and all that. Like, he's not making all that up. It's the real deal. And I think there's a little bit more authenticity to somebody when they're coming from a point of they actually did it. This is real. This is how it is. And I was even a fan of his. I don't know if he still does it anymore. The Church of What's Happening Now. I think he shut it down.
I remember he had some like recent guys on, like not too long ago. I know he had John Bernthal on, who plays the Punisher for many of you. were wondering. He's had on big names like that, but I don't. And those are like pretty recent celebrities, so I don't know. I wish I could tell you, but
Yeah.
you know, he's also a podcast hopper. He's always on shows,
Oh yeah.
and so he's not out of money by any means.
No, no, not by any stretch. So tell us a little bit about you and your background, and kind of we'll get into your podcast, your experiences in it, because I always find it interesting how people got in this game. I don't think no two people get into it the same way, and then your vision changes. Sometimes your brand changes, and we'll get into where you want to take it. But let's start with growing up, early life, and then we'll kind of work our way forward.
Well, I'm from Jersey, so that's the first thing, and we're lagging again. Go figure. But I'm from Jersey, so um, early life. What about my early life? Because there's like so many things I could go into.
I mean, so Jersey, like what part of Jersey?
North Jersey.
North Jersey. So I don't know a ton about that. Only thing I always like base my Jersey knowledge off Sopranos. So, so like Bloomfield and what's the other place that they talked about in there? It's where his house is. Uh, I'm blanking. Have you seen the Sopranos?
No, I haven't seen the show. I know a lot of people that have, but it's a good show.
All right, folks, we're good with this interview. We're gonna wrap it up. You got to go watch that show. That's the best show ever. Like, even if you're not into mob or mafia content, like that's only really a backdrop to the show. It's essentially about a guy that has a very eccentric, narcissistic mother. He's got a nagging wife. He's got kids that drive him up the wall. He just happens to be a mob boss, and he has the same problems with a lot of his coworkers, if you will, if that's how you want to describe it. And it's just a great show. It's got elements of comedy. The more you watch it, I think it's really a comedy with bits of drama as opposed to the opposite. There's just so much comedy in it.
Well, I mean, I've watched so my buddy Analyzing Evil. So he does phenomenal videos.
Mhm.
And I recommend people go watch him. He's been on my show twice, and he is known for the series. His real name is Jamal. His channel name is Violi, and his most famous series is Analyzing Evil. Right. I introduced him to Julian, and that's how they met. And they did an episode together, which was really cool. But he actually did an episode on Tony, and he analyzes like all these characters from fiction. Now he's gonna. I think he might start doing history soon. I don't know. But he does all these characters in fiction. One of them was Tony Soprano, and in it he spoke about how, and it's an hour long because he watches the whole show and bit by bit goes into what their motives are and every piece of media. Super, very, very dedicated to his craft. Far
I
more.
can, I can already tell you I'm going to want this guy, just so you know. I'm going to need him on the show.
All right, I'll text you his contact information, or I'll ask him if he's open to being on your show. But he watches, like, he reads full books, and he broke down Tony, and he was talking about how Tony grew up, and he was talking about how the therapist in the show is a very accurate portrayal of dealing with somebody with sociopathic tendencies. So I've known a very general idea about the Sopranos, about how it's a much more real world perspective of it all. It's not like super out there and crazy like maybe a show like Breaking Bad is, though
Right.
there are elements of that. But I've known people that haven't liked Breaking Bad because it's just so crazy, and there's like, oh, now they're putting hydrochloric acid in the bathtub, which I have watched a bit of Breaking Bad, and like I agree, it's like a little bit over the top sometimes, but
Yeah. I think you have to in certain aspects of television. I remember I wasn't a Breaking Bad fan until it was about to go off the air. I'd never watched it. Just I understood the premise and I heard people talking about it, but it was just like I always tend to get into shows late. And I watched like the first season because my buddy just kept telling me, like, man, it's a great show. You'll love it. You'll love it. I know it's up your alley. And I watched the first season. I was kind of like, it's like, it's okay. But if I never watch it again, I'm not going to be like, oh my God, what did I miss? I made it through the second season. I kind of felt the same way. It was interesting enough for me to keep watching. But then and I don't know how much you've seen of the show, but when they introduced a character by the name of Gus Fring, who ran the chicken franchise, and it just after that, like then I was hooked and I binged all the way to current. And then luckily, like the final season was airing on whatever channel that was. I can't remember. I don't know I don't remember what uh network it was on, but like I was able to catch it as the last season was on. Had I watched that third season, when it was out, and I'd had to wait all them years to finally get to that, it would have been excruciating because it was so good. And I think that's more like anything. Once people kind of find their footing with the story, then they can really dig in. That's why a lot of times your second and third seasons are largely, the best because you find your characters' footing, you find their ground, and then you can really start to speak. You know what the audience likes. You'll read reviews, and directors take all that into account. And the reason I bring that up is we were mentioning Sopranos. They just released a documentary, which I think if you haven't watched the show, I recommend watching the documentary just for context because David Chase, the creator, it's pretty much a movie style documentary about why he created the show, where he got the inspirations from. Like a lot of Tony's mother was his mother. His a lot of his personal things that had happened to him, he put into the show. And I think that's a lot with real life, especially with movie directors. They'll put their own experiences in there. That way they don't have to necessarily say, hey, this happened to me, but it gives context, for the actual show itself.
So yeah, so it's funny you're saying this too because uh, you would probably like the analyzing evil guy because um he it's funny you're talking about somebody who made content based on their own experience because I learned this from Julian's interview that because Julian goes very in depth about like people's personal lives and
Oh
like
yeah.
and things like that and how they became the way they are, and that's really cool. Like that's really cool that he does that. And I remember when he did the interview with Analyzing Evil or Violi or Jamal, whichever name we're gonna call him. Jamal was actually the son of like a nightclub owner, gangster, wannabe type of guy, and he talked about how his dad never hit him. His dad never hit him. I think were his words, like, or that it was rarely physical. It was rarely physical abuse. But it was just like the guy was always just not a good guy, and eventually his parents got divorced. But I think part of the reason why I think he said I don't know if he said this, but it's like seeing all these like I don't know, just seeing evil growing up and seeing like evil in the world. Like he's like, all right, I think that was partly why he did it, but he also said that it was because it was to promote a book originally. That's why he started the channel.
Hmm.
But pain, and the way that people interpret pain is a very interesting way of making art because some people take pain and they use it as an excuse not to work. Other people use pain as nothing but motivation to work.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. And speaking of motivation, like where did you get your motivation to come in to the podcast game originally? And I guess maybe we should preface this too, like start off, how old are you? That's really young, but also it's great that you started this early because you've been doing this now. How long have you been in this?
Like a year and a half or so, because I was like about to turn 16. So I was like late 15 and I was just about to turn 16 when I started doing this.
I think that's a perfect age because at that age you're started. Obviously, you got a lot of life to live and a lot of experiences to have, but you're starting to grasp the concept of the real world, what it's like, you're getting more responsibilities, school's probably getting a little harder, things of that nature. So you have a little bit better understanding of life as opposed to somebody a lot younger than that. But I'm trying to get my son to like start something now because I'm like, if you can start it now, even if it's not a fast growing thing, which most aren't unless you have like a big name, but like by the time you get 20, you'll have a pretty good little following if you keep up at it and going. So I guess I ask you at that age, what was the most impressionable thing that got you wanting to do a podcast?
So, I mean, I was on this guy, Chris Antics show. Good dude. And he's down in Philly. I don't know where you are, but if you would
South
ever want to
Carolina.
go on, what?
South Carolina.
Okay, so yeah, you might be able to drive down there. I'll put you guys in touch if you want.
Yeah.
But this guy, when he did his interview with me, he actually asked me the same questions. Like, okay, why did you start the podcast? And to basically reiterate the story, my grandpa died and my dog died within the same week. So then I kind of had this question where I'm like, what do I want to do with myself? What do I want to do with my life? And I was at a point where I really wasn't doing anything with my time outside of school. And the time that I was spending in school was just this exhausting sort of. it was exhausting and meaningless, I would say. I never, because I was in like all the I was like in all these super hard classes I didn't even want to take or care about. And I'm going home and I'm just sleeping. I don't care to work out and do. I was invited to work out and I was invited to all these things, but I was like a bum about it and I didn't want to do it. Basically, because I was just partly because I was lazy, partly because I was just also inundated with work from school.
Hmm.
And then eventually, my grandpa dies, and so does my dog. And I just had this very big question of what do I do with myself, and I came up with the idea of starting a podcast and interviewing people. And the original idea of starting this podcast was, and I always say this, it was supposed to look very different from how it actually ended up being. Because originally it was supposed to be like a soft white underbelly, but almost kind of like reverse, where I'm interviewing like self improvement and charity workers, self improvement like people and charity workers, and like maybe homeless people too. And then it formed into YouTubers, and then to Navy SEALs, and then anybody and everybody. And that's kind of where I am now, where I'm interviewing some people that are like YouTubers with millions of followers, and other people that are just millionaires, and then other people that are falsely convicted fraudsters, and all these just very, very wildly different people, all of which I've learned very interesting lessons from.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's so great how the networking works in that world. I go to these events sometimes, these parties or movie premieres or whatever, and like it's like the workhorse in me doesn't really take the time to enjoy what I'm at because it's always like meeting people, seeing who the next guest could be. It's a really never ending style job. And I don't know how serious mentally, it weighs on you. But to me, like, it's always, I guess it's kind of like being a TV show creator. You would like for your next episode to outdo your last one. And I'm assuming that's kind of your mindset.
100%. I did an interview with this guy Jack Rysider, who you actually might like to have on. Another guy you might like for me to introduce you to. I don't know how busy he is though, because he gets like hundreds of thousands of messages a day. But with this guy, he runs the podcast Darknet Diaries. Have you heard of it?
No, but it sounds like something I would like to hear about.
I'm surprised you haven't heard of it. So he interviews hackers. Sometimes they're people that have been caught. Sometimes they're people that are years later after the hack they haven't been caught, but they kind of know what went on.
Mhm.
So, you know, with I forgot what I was gonna say now.
I know Darknet Diaries was who you were talking about.
Oh, wait, I know what I was talking about, but what was the you just said? Oh yeah, so
One up in the last episode.
oh yeah. So in my conversation with him, I had said to him like, what's your goal here with getting guests? And his response was, he's like, well, original, like I said to him, who would be a dream guest? I think because in that sort of world of like hackers and like tech people, and sometimes he interviews like CIA people and spies. I'm like, who's your dream guest? Because like you've had on like all these people. Who is your dream guest? And he goes, I think the dream guest that I would want to have is the guy who's never told a story before. And he said originally his dream guest would be like the NSA, because the NSA and the US government would never reveal how they would hack
Right.
somebody. And then he ended up actually getting the director of the NSA to sign off and give permission for an episode, which he told that story on my show. He also told the story of how he got scammed on my show, which is promotion for why you should watch that episode. It's my I think it's like it's my tied favorite because I have two favorites. But yeah, so it's interesting where some people's minds go. Like, because for me, it's always just been who's a bigger guest. Like, who's the next big? Who's a bigger guest than who I've had on?
Yeah.
And that's a question that I've had from the start, because when I started the show, and most people don't know this because most people, or some people know this, but it's like people at my school that watch my show and people that I've already told this. The first person I ever had on was this guy named Improvement Pill, right? And he responded to me within 5 minutes. And he has like 3.8 million subscribers. And he's like the biggest self improvement YouTuber on YouTube. And he was my first guest. So then you can imagine the chip on your shoulders when you have that guy on as your first guest. And people are like, George, how did you get that guy on? So then you have to have the next guest be a really big YouTuber. And when I
Mhm.
had Analyzing Evil on. That guy has like 800,000 subscribers now. Then you have a Navy SEAL. So then, like, that was always the question of like, okay, like how do I bring on a bigger guest? And
Set the bar high in the beginning.
I started very high in the beginning, and it's funny because he's still the most famous guest I've ever had on in terms of numbers.
Right. Yeah, that was always a thing with me. It was like, and sometimes, like, honestly, and I'm not obviously, I enjoy all the episodes that I do, but some of the best conversations don't necessarily come from like the bigger name guest. And it's not to me, it's just like general conversations that I've had, I think have come off better because the downside to getting somebody that everybody knows is a lot of times they've heard their story before. So they're going to see which way you spin it a little bit. I'll watch, and sometimes I do that for research. I'll watch a guy that's interviewed on this channel, this channel, partly because I don't like to recover the same things, but I want to see if I can pick out something different that nobody else has covered, which has kind of been my way I go about it. But when you have those guests on that people maybe haven't heard of or haven't heard their story, I do think you get some benefit from that. And, it's either way you look at it, it's still a constant battle of trying to re-up, what you did last week. And it becomes very hectic. It's like you can't even have if you do a weekly episode, I don't know how often you drop, but if you do a weekly one, like it's like a constant thing. And you do it and then it's done because you can't think about how good the last one was. You got to hop on to the next one.
Everybody has their dream guest. Like, for me, I've had multiple people on with millions of followers. So meeting famous people, like it isn't the same anymore. So what my famous is very different from what it used to be. Cause it used to be like, oh, if I met a guy with 100,000 followers, that'd be such an impressive thing. And I used to meet guys with like 50,000 followers and think like, oh, that's so impressive. That's so crazy. But now I'm like, it's like, that's cool. But it's like, it's not what it used to be to me.
No, I get that 100%. And like, it's strange what becomes normal. Cause like, I look back in movie stuff, like I'm a big movie guy and I've interviewed some big names. Like, I don't know if you know Cheech and Chong, who Cheech and Chong is.
I saw that interview with you. Yeah.
So
Tommy Chong.
Yeah, I interviewed Tommy Chong, and like to me, he was a legend before my time. And so, like when I was growing up,
he's still a legend. He's still a legend. He's been on Mike Tyson's show. He's been on Steve-O's show. Like, I'm surprised he went on yours.
Yeah,
no offense, but like, I didn't expect that when I saw your I think it's your most popular one up. Like,
no, Gene Borello is the most popular one.
But when I saw him, I was like, this is Tommy Chong. Like, I wasn't expecting to see that name. But that's cool though. I'm glad that you had him. But go on.
Another big one was Tom Sizemore. Tom Sizemore was. So yeah, I mean, he passed away about a year and some change ago, but like done some major movies like Natural Born Killers, Saving Private Ryan, Heat, probably one of the best bank robbing movies ever. And he shared stories about making that movie with, Robert De Niro, Val Kilmer, Al Pacino, Michael Mann directed it, who done, Miami Vice and a lot of the other stuff. I mean, like, being able to actually talk to somebody. And I had conversations. I think the show I did with Tom was like almost 3.5 hours. It was 2 different interviews. We had to break it up, but like we just talked about so much stuff it wasn't scripted by any means. It was just general conversation. And then when you tell people later on, because like when it's done, you're kind of like, oh, okay, that was cool. And then you move on. But when you tell people you had these on, at some point it kind of becomes normal. And you think, God, this is really kind of surreal that this is kind of normal that not necessarily associate, like we don't hang out, but like I had Tom Sizemore's phone number in my call log.
Right.
Like 5 years ago, if you'd have told me I would have his number in my phone log and I see him on TV, I'm like, no fucking way. Like it's not happening. But it's just, it's strange how this podcast world can bring people together like that. And you talked about your vision, why you started it. And then you said it changed, as you started interviewing these people. What was the change as it started progressing?
So I'm glad that you asked this because I feel like this is something I've thought about myself and I kind of want to go into it. So I thank you for asking that question. So, the change. So again, the original vision, it's like you're going to be interviewing like low, but also high up people, like people that are helping people or people that are going through struggles, whether it be self-improvement, ultra famous people, or it's people that are homeless, right? The reason that it changed, I think, was because it just came down to the difficulty of the guest. And so So think about it like this. So if you have a guy with like that many millions of followers on the first time, I just got really lucky. Like that's the truth. I just got really lucky. And you start to think like, okay, well maybe this can happen to anybody. And so I was also kind of lazy. So I would just interview I would email like one guy occasionally here and there.
Mhm.
And I would get a response, and sometimes and I'd be like, "Hey, yeah, sure. When are you available?" And he just wouldn't respond. And I'm not gonna say his name, but there's like a decently big YouTuber. There's been a few decently big names too, like 5 million subscribers. And they would email me back, and they'd be like, maybe, kind of, sort of, and that still happens to this day. But when you're emailing like one guy here and there, that's just what happens. Like, especially. So when I interviewed Analyzing Evil, I actually expect him to say no when I messaged him on Discord, because I messaged him on Discord because I found him in his Discord server. He was super active there. So then I reached out to him, and I didn't expect to find him, and I didn't expect for him at all to even respond. So when he responded, that was big. But my heart was like kind of beating fast when I messaged him the link to my podcast, and I'm like, I've only ever done one episode before, and I would love to have you on, and I'm a big fan. And then he's like, absolutely. And so then he comes on and we do this interview. But then from there, the same question arises where you have a guy that has 800,000 or 600,000 at the time, and then another guy was like 2.7 million subscribers. And then you have to say, okay, well, you have to kind of be realistic after a little bit. And you have to say, okay, who can I interview, but who would also still be cool to interview? So then I reached out to a few Navy SEALs and a few DA guys. And the problem is I was reaching out to like current DA guys and current FBI guys who can't speak on anything. Yeah, and I had to learn that the hard way, because then I was getting like left unread. And so then nobody responding to me. And I was, again, very lazy with how I messaged people. We messaged like one guy maybe every 3 days. Then all of a sudden I get a Navy SEAL that responds. Super good guy. His name is Stephen Giblin. And he's like, yeah, sure, let's do it. And I interviewed him. And from there, I'm like, oh, why not have another guy like this? Like, I really like that. And that was a smaller, like lesser known guy, but still cool. And I learned a lot from him. So why not push this a little further? Let's interview the judge in the Chris Christie case, the Bridgegate trial, which I don't think has ever done an interview about what happened exactly. So that was really cool. And so I interviewed him. And then
how'd you go about getting in touch with him? Just out of curiosity.
I don't want to say.
Okay.
But you know what? I'm sure it's on that interview, but I don't want to say it. It's nothing that crazy. I'll tell you afterwards why I don't want to say it. But
yeah, I got you. I only asked because like you mentioned Discord, and even now I've never thought about trying to track people down on Discord, but I guess it makes sense. But I've used LinkedIn.
Yeah.
I've used all kinds of stuff. Like I remember, I don't know if you know who Michael Thompson is, but he spent like, I want to say 40 years in prison. I may be off on that number, but he was one of the top Aryan Brotherhood shot callers.
Oh, yeah.
He's done a lot of the big podcasts, Vlad, and, some of the other ones. And he had recently got out of prison, a few years ago. And I tried to track him down because I seen he started doing interviews, and I couldn't find him anywhere. And then I found that he started like a nonprofit business. I searched that. The link didn't come up for it. I messaged him, and I was just like, hey, I don't even know if this is actually going to Michael, or if this is, if it's just going to a secretary that handles stuff for the actual business. But like, I'm looking for him. I'd really like to interview him. And then he responded. He's like, yes, it is me. And then we, had some correspondence, and I was able to have him on. And it was a great show. So it's like, you kind of are podcasting, and then you're part-time, like when you start to dig into it and try to find these guests, part-time PI trying to track people down.
Yes, very. I feel that way all the time. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have any okay, actually, the most interesting person, like when it came to like reaching out to people in the terms of like how far I had to go, I'm trying to think of who that would be, because there's a few people that like I've gotten very close to having on that, again, just never, that would have been really big interviews that just never happened. And then there's other, but in terms of like the reaching out, like the struggle to reach out, Jack Reisider, I think, is, I'm going to mention again this episode, partly because of promotion, but also just because it is my favorite. My two favorite episodes are Dr. Peter Langman, who is who's like the #1 school shooting researcher in all of America. I think that's my best interview. And I think Jack Reisider was my best discussion. And they're tied just for different reasons. if you want a good time, listen to the Jack Riceheader one. The school shooting one is not like if you want to like listen with your family. Like it's not a super upbeat one, but
But
with him,
an interesting topic though, especially with everything that's going on. You just had one here recently,
yeah, right,
in Atlanta, and matter of fact, just to piggyback on that, the school my son goes to, someone had written on the bathroom walls last Friday they were going to shoot up the school, had everybody in an uproar. This weekend, somebody made a anonymous Facebook post to a group that they're going to shoot it up Thursday. I mean, like it's getting out of hand with all these school shootings. So, like, because I'm interested in why this is happening or what kind of insight he has right now with the current landscape of everything, that episode would interest me. Yeah, I wouldn't play it at the dinner table, but I would definitely.
Yeah, no, that's like I've never actually said that before. That's my favorite. Those are my two favorite interviews because I've really thought about it in my head the ones that I really like the best. And if I had to like recommend two, it would be those two. Like if I had to recommend any episodes to start, it'd be those two because one is like they're both like one is the best interview I've done. The other one is the best discussion I've done.
Right.
And one is a well-known YouTuber and podcaster, and the other guy is like just like a psychologist. But back to my point with tracking down Jack. So Jack, I don't know. So as you can imagine, when you're interviewing hackers, for whatever reason, he doesn't like to show his face. I don't know if he ever has. I've heard he has. I couldn't find it. He's basically like, you can't find the guy. Like even on Instagram, because on Instagram he has like 100,000 followers. Yeah, his messages open, and sure he has Twitter open too. But on all of his platforms, he has like 100,000 plus followers. So, and he's a well-known guy. So as you can imagine, that's a tremendously difficult task to message him and hope for a response back on one of those platforms. Yeah. So I'm like, I'm not even going to try there, which I never try Instagram DMs when it comes to reaching out to like super big guests. I rarely ever do. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I get a response, but very rarely, because it's a very low success rate. So with Jack, I went to his YouTube to try and find a contact email. There's not even a contact email for him. Like, and he doesn't want to be known. I don't know his real name. It's not like I can like look up like, okay, maybe his family or on Facebook. No. There's nothing. So then I finally realized, I'm like, Discord. And I go to his Discord and I'm like, he's active. Yes. And so I messaged him and I'm like, hey, would you want to do an interview? And he's like, sure. And he just did it right then and there. But what's so crazy about him and like how crazy private he is with his information for good reason. When I messaged him, I'm like, hey, what's your email? I'll share you the Google Meet with that. And then he goes, just copy and paste the link here. Like, you didn't even want me to get his email. I'm like, you know what? Fine. I respect that. He's the guest. So I just copy and paste the link, and that was it. And then we did the interview. But that was, that's like the hardest I think I've ever tried to track down a guest like that. Then there's been other people, but I'm not going to say all their names, but it's like usually like former criminals, like people like that are just not public. I could say, yeah, I'm not even going to say their names, but it's just like, there have been people like that. Yes. And other times it's like, you don't even know if it's the real person. Like sometimes I feel like I'm like talking to a scam account because they have so low followers. Like, yeah. I remember I had Jack Barsky on, who was he's a KGB defector. And I thought for a second that when I messaged him, I'm like, is this a scam account? Like, you only had 2,000 followers, but this guy's been on Jordan Peterson. He's been on Lex Friedman. He's been on like the biggest shows in the world. And here I am, like, he has a platform with like 2,000 followers only. And I'm like, okay. And I just messaged him and it was him. So, that happens too. But yes, you do feel like a private investigator when it comes to reaching out to people sometimes.
Yeah. And it's weird. I've had good luck on Instagram. Honestly, that's where I started reaching out to people. And when I was get responses back from some of the people, it would just blow my mind of like, wow, they check their shit and then they respond back. And it's been a great tool for me. Obviously, throughout the time you learn, different avenues to go. Like I said, the LinkedIn, the Discord's a great, something to throw in there too. And just something that had never even crossed my mind. Where do you get because there's two ways to go about this. I feel if you want to go about podcasting, especially if you're just starting out, if you think I'm going to get into this and make money, that's not true. I hope people realize that and understand this. People say, oh, you must be rolling in money. I'm like, no, not really. I may, after 2 years, have paid off the equipment I bought when I first started. And I don't have a lot of stuff, so let that sink in. But where do you get your, I guess, modes of how long an episode are going to be, how long you're going to go? Because like you hear people say, well, the demographic says, 35 to 45 minutes is the sweet spot. Well, yeah, if you're going for you want a lot of views and you're trying to make money with it, maybe. But like, if I'm having a good story with a guy, I'm gonna roll. I'm gonna keep going. And I've seen people that have 2-3 hour podcasts. Julian Dory's a perfect example. He goes 2 to 3 hours like nobody's business. Same with Matt Cox. So, but then you have other YouTubers like Cinemills TV. I did an interview with them. They wanted to keep it about 45 minutes. I wound up going over with Michael Francis, another big YouTuber. I did an interview with him. He wanted to keep it about 45-ish minutes. We wound up going right at an hour. How do you get your ideas of, how long you're going to run? Do you have a set time you want to stay around? What happens if it's just so good you keep going? How do you handle those situations?
So I had that happen very recently. So I had John Kiriakou on, who is the guy who exposed CIA torture. So he exposed the CIA as torturing people. And that was a cool interview because, originally I was expecting the interview to go for 40 minutes. Right. Yeah. And he was, with him, when I did the interview, like when I was planning with him, I'm like 40 minutes, give or take. And that interview now is like, I'm trying to think of how long it actually went, like an hour, 10 minutes or so. Went for much longer than it was supposed to. Because I didn't, and this is no offense to John, but I didn't expect to actually enjoy his presence as much as I did, right? Because some guests, it's like, okay, I've heard the story like before, and this is part of the reason why I've also made a change in my content as of very recently, if anybody cares enough to know, where it's, I used to interview a lot of military, police, former crime, criminals, and all these different people. And I eventually realized, I'm like, okay, I've heard the same story 1,000 times. I mean, as interesting as many of these people are, it's just, I've heard it so many times. And after doing an hour every single time, I realized, I'm like, not everybody needs an hour to say what they need to say, right? Like, I don't need to keep forcing myself to spit out questions to get this person to keep talking. Maybe this person only needs 20 minutes. So I started doing these like 20-minute interviews where I would just be like, what's the biggest lesson you learned? What's the biggest this? And I got so much more out of it. And I also learned, I'm like, okay, if I want to keep going, I can keep going. But sometimes I think this is all I need. Or sometimes I think this is all I want. Like this is,
yeah.
Or maybe this is all the person needs to say or has to say. And it goes from there. So, there's no real, it's exactly like what you're saying, where there's sometimes a set plan and sometimes you do follow that plan. Other times, I like with Matt Cox, supposed to go for an hour, went for an hour and like a half. Vile Eye, Analyzing Evil, there was no set time. It went for almost 2 hours.
Wow.
The longest episode I ever did was like 2 hours, 30 minutes. And it's my worst interview. I'm not even going to say which one it is because it's 2 parts. Because I talked way too much throughout that whole interview. And it's like, and I just didn't like it for that reason because I feel like that guy was so much more interesting than my input. But other than that, I basically just choose as I go along. If sometimes I'll set it up again. So sometimes I'll set up a time, but usually it's just whatever me and the guests want.
I found like when I had like a thing I would copy and paste, but I would just change the name at the top. So if I was sending this to somebody off Sopranos or something like that, I would say, "Dear Mr. Whoever," or, very interesting having you on my show. Some of my past guests include, I would go down the line, great to have you on. Interviews would run roughly 45 minutes to an hour, give or take. And then I would obviously, to keep me from having to retype that every time, I would save it, change the name, send it to the next person. And that's how I would kind of go about getting the guests. And then when we would get on, I would kind of ask, what's your time frame? What are you looking like? So I'll know, when I need to wrap up. Some of them say, yeah, I got about 45 minutes. Yeah, I've got an hour. Some of them like, man, I got all night, brother. It's up to you. But I always felt like if somebody's coming on, especially if somebody's done a podcast and it's, a celebrity of sorts, I guess, I don't want to keep them for more than an hour. To me, that's being rude. They got time. They got stuff they got to do. They got stuff they want. Now, if it's somebody that's really passionate about their story and they want to get the message out there, that's different. Sometimes it takes longer than an hour. But if it's somebody that I feel like is an established star, they made their money, they're coming on to talk about a TV show they did 20 years ago for my benefit, I feel selfish keeping them for longer than an hour. But then some people are way more than willing to do it. And Tommy Chong was a perfect example. I think that episode was over 2 hours. And a couple of times at around the hour 10 mark, you'll see I was trying to make my way into wrapping it up because I didn't want to be rude, but he kept going. And I'm
Right.
just like, well, fuck, it's Tommy Chong. If he wants to keep going, Tommy's going to keep going. And I'm going to sit right here and listen. And
Right.
I think you just get a feel for it. I do like to ask just out of respect, because if they say an hour, then I'll make sure I get the points I want to cover, and then I'll know when to start winding it down. But I've had some that's went to, I think the longest I ever had was right at 3 hours. It was like 2.5, 2:45. And it was with a undercover ATF agent named Jay Dobbins that infiltrated the Hells Angels. Very, very interesting interview. I had seen a documentary on it on the Gangland series on the History Channel years ago. He's got a book out. I bought the book. I'd read the book. We communicated through email. It was football season. He was coaching where he was at. He was like, can you get back with me, after the season's over? I have a little bit more free time. And so it took a couple months. We communicated, we got together, and I was like, you got a lot to cover, man. I was like, what's your time frame? And he said, you go till you're satisfied. And I went in hard. And, because I enjoy these things, and these are things that I feel like I would want to hear if I was a watcher of it. And I think that's really you just get the feel of it, I think, as you keep doing them. And I'll be honest with you, man, I'm really astonished at like some of the guests that you've had on and some of the people that you've talked to at early in the game and as young as you are. Like, I hate to keep bringing and putting emphasis on age, but it's just impressive that you're able to do this at such an early age. By the time, I'm 40s. I was going to say, by the time you're my age, you'd be the next Joe Rogan. Who knows?
We can only hope.
Yeah.
We can only hope. Well, I appreciate that. And it's something I've gotten where it's like, George, how do you get these guests? Sometimes it's like, oh, how do you get these guests? But I've also had the occasional person that says, oh, they're not that famous, George. No, like they're not that famous. And I'm like, okay, well, what's your definition of famous? And I've realized my definition of famous has also changed, because to some people, having people with 500,000 followers on Instagram is not famous. To other people, it's a really big deal. Yep. So other people, you just can't impress no matter what you do. So, I've also had to learn about so many different things, like while doing this, of like what I like and what my tastes are. So going back to like the crime stuff and like what I'm supposed to do, what I'm not supposed to do. Like, I've had to now start like turning down like some of the true crime people, not like out of anything, but just the fact that I don't know if I don't think I want to keep doing it. Or not even I don't think. I know I don't want to keep doing it. I've heard all the true crime stories. I've heard all the crazy cons and all, all the stock fraud and the Ponzi scheme. And then I've heard it. Like, I know what's going to happen. You get caught. Sometimes you learn your lesson. Sometimes you don't. So, and it's like, yeah, I've learned some really cool things and I met some really cool people, but it's just not for me anymore, like to do the true crime stuff. So that's why I'm moving into like moving more influencers from going forward. I hope at least influencers and, successful businessmen and entrepreneurs and people like that. Like, I interviewed just this one guy recently who made like $700,000 in like 2 years from a chat bot subscription service that he made. And I interviewed another guy who went from he traded $26 into $2.7 million. That was a really interesting one. But yeah, so
I'll shoot him $26 right now if he can do that for me.
Well, he actually offers a course, and some of his students, I asked him, like, who's your most successful student? He's like, the most successful student he ever had was a guy who traded. He started with like I want to say $1,000 maybe, and within like 3 months he made like 1.1 million. And yeah, I know. That was my face too. I asked him about how like money changed his life, and like if I actually also asked him, funny enough, I don't know if it is in the recording, but I'm fine with saying this. I asked him, like, can I reach out to this person? And he's like, maybe. And I'm like, what do you mean maybe? And he goes, well, he doesn't really talk to me anymore ever since he made that money. And then I'm like, oh, like, but like, so I don't know. Maybe I'll get that interview one day. It'll show up on the channel.
Yeah. Oh, money. I think that's interesting because, you think about when will money change people when that happens. That's always a thing. Some people stay true to who they are and their roots, and some people change. And I think it really just depends on like who you are and where you come from. I think that's why athletes have so much trouble, because if you have an athlete that grew up in poverty, grew up poor, but they excelled in academics, and luckily they got a free ride to college, so they don't have to worry about paying for college because they're on the athletic scholarship. And say they're fortunate enough to get drafted in the NFL, especially years ago before they had a cap on what rookies could make. If you were a first round pick, you could come into a lot of money. I'm talking, millions and millions and millions of dollars. So for somebody to come from nothing to have access to that kind of money so quick, that's a recipe for disaster. And you see it with the lottery shows of people that hit the lottery. 99% of them don't turn out too good.
Right. So it's funny you're saying that, because when I did the interview with John Bosiak, I spoke to him. You know John Bosiak?
Oh yeah. He was at Matt's house last time I was up there.
Yeah, he's a cool. Well, they're I think they live together.
Yeah,
but,
he stays there.
Yeah. So he's cool. I'm trying to think. So with not Matt Cox, I'm sorry, John Bosiak, we had this conversation about lavish lifestyles and like how it relates to crime and like showing off. And I asked him, like, what's the most expensive thing you ever bought? But we actually got into the conversation about lotteries. And he's like, and I said to him, why is it always that like some really trashy like person who lives in an RV or a trailer park is always the guy to win the lottery, and like he always spends it on like whatever. You can make the funny joke about like coke and hookers, like or blackjack and hookers or whatever, right? Because there's a video of a guy where he's like saying like in an interview where they're like, sir, what do you want to buy when you win the lottery? And he's married too, which is a funny part. He's like, oh, coke and hookers.
Yeah, a bunch of hookers and cocaine. You won't believe how many people's tagged me in that video and said, "Is that you?"
Yeah, well, but that's how people think, though. Like people that don't have money don't understand how fast it actually goes. Like they think that it's limitless once, because they've lived with, like, let's say a limit of however much money, $2,000 a month or so, and then you're given 10 million. It seems like this endless supply of money, like that's never going to end, and then it does, and then they're back where they started. And there was this other guy. He made this. It's this really infamous picture of this really heavy guy, hairy chest and everything, and he has a champagne glass and he's in a hot tub, right? I think you know what I'm talking about. Maybe you don't. But he won the lottery, and within like a span of, I'm trying to think, it was either a really short amount of time or it was like a semi-short amount of time. It was like 8 years, and he was right back where he started, and he was a garbage man again. He was a garbage man from the start, and he ended up a garbage man.
Yeah, I do remember hearing that story. I can't remember the name of it right off the bat, but I do remember hearing that story. There was a guy, I want to say somewhere in Texas, and one of his daughters, I think, got hooked on drugs, and then she was killed. He was robbed once for some money. He was defrauded trying to start businesses with the money. It's like, you just can't trust people when you have that kind of money. It's very hard. And, they say, I mean, it's the tale is all the time. Money's the root of all evil. And it's 100% true. And I think, especially when you're a criminal, it's like, if you're taking all this risk, you're risking going to jail. What are you doing it for if you can't have fun with it and show it off? And a lot of guys were like, you had to spend the money. You can't keep it. You can't go if you're doing illegal stuff, you can't go put $200,000, $300,000 in a bank. What are you going to do? You got to. And so then that becomes the lifestyle that becomes very addicting. Tim McBride, you know who Tim McBride is?
Yeah.
He was the weed, I guess you would say smuggler. Like he wasn't a seller, but he would get it from point A to point B. He's been on Danny's show. I don't know if he was on Julian's, but I know he's been on Matt's. But Tim McBride, tells a great story. And he was just like, I asked him, I was like, what do you do with all that money? He's like, you got to spend it. He's like, you go to the clubs, you go to the strip clubs, you're throwing hundreds at the doorman, hundreds at the DJs, hundreds at the women. I mean, because like you said, if you keep it, you become a target to your friends or enemies or other dealers or whatever, if they know you got millions of dollars hidden in a stash house. So he's like, you stash some away for a rainy day, but in large part, you live it up. You enjoy the risk of reward of what you're doing, because you have your life's hanging in the balance every day.
So another thing I want to say was that John Bosiak's ultimate point with the lottery was, dude, these are the types of people that play the lottery. They're the people that are looking for a handout. Like they're the type they're the people that, of course, they're going to be people that are poor, living in an RV, like low middle class, just because those are the types of people that have that type of mindset, that they want a handout. They want that chance of winning. They want the chance of a way out. And those are the types of people that play, unfortunately. It's not, you don't usually see Jeff Bezos playing the lottery. You don't see, because it's not because they don't even need the money, because if that was the case, then they would just sell their money and live on an island. That's not why. If they could make money off of it, they would. But because it doesn't make sense why they're going to scratch off a ticket for 10 grand when, well, I mean, you again,
Probably
like
look
it,
at that in
like,
the sofa.
well, there's a saying, a billionaire wastes money picking up 100, like, or something like that. Like it's an idea where if you're a billionaire and you go to bend down to pick up a $100 bill, right? You actually lost money by picking up a $100 bill. Or maybe it was like Joe Rogan telling a story. He's like, if Bill Gates were to pick up a $100 bill, like he'd be losing money. And I thought about that. Like, yeah, that's true. Like he would technically be losing money because in that 10 seconds he picks up that 100, like he could have been making thousands, like
Yeah.
theoretically. Because I think Jeff Bezos makes in 11 hours he made like $100 million, or he makes $100 million, just something insane, something ridiculous, like once in a lifetime amounts of money he makes every day. And you're rolling your eyes right now, but that's just that's some people.
The hot tour girl, Haley Welch, is a perfect example. I told my, we were joking around the other day. She's got her own podcast, and I'll say this right now: I'm not a hater of Haley Welch. I actually think she's very funny, and say what you want about what she said, whether it was an innuendo for a sex act or whatever. Like for a small period of time, for a week, that girl took over the entire internet. There was memes galore. And it made everybody forget about it, just how bad of a state this country's in right now. And it brought laughter. And it was funny. Everybody had the spit on that thing memes and just the pictures and the videos. And, I know people got tired of it because it was everywhere. But it was like, to me, I appreciated that. It brought a little bit of, comedy back to the world. And then she capitalized on it. And I don't blame her a damn bit. And now she's got her own show and she's backed by Better and Jake Paul. And they said the other day that she's eclipsed her first million. This was a girl that 3 months ago or 6 months ago, however long it was, I don't think was nowhere near $1 million. She talks about the town she grew up in, her upbringing. So I'm just like, life-changing money in a matter of 3 months because you were having a good time and you've done an interview with, somebody on the street. That's how quick it can happen. And, shout out to her. I hope she does her thing and keeps going. Hawk to her.
Well, you know what? I actually do have a lot of respect for her because I think that, and I'm going to be very honest, I didn't find the meme that funny. Like it's like, okay, fine. Like whatever. Like to me, it's like, fine. Like it is what it is. And it wasn't that funny. But I really respect the fact that she capitalized on her fame when she did. So I respect that. I respect the fact that she doesn't seem like highly egotistical to me. She's not making it about her. She also doesn't say the thing like everywhere she goes. She's not like making it like that's her thing. Like she's clearly trying to branch out. And what was cool was when she did her first interview, she immediately got a manager. Like if you watch her first interview with Barstool, I think it was, she gets a manager. Like she said, like, oh yeah, I got a manager. Like I got a manager, and she immediately started making brand deals, and like her manager started introducing her to these people. Like that is a good example of somebody who got really lucky, who decided I'm going to capitalize on my fame. So like I remember I had Scumbag Steve on. Scumbag Steve, the meme. I had the Scumbag Steve. I had the guy in the photo. His name is like Blake Boston, and he follows me on Instagram. And he and I were talking, and I'm like, what's your biggest regret? He's like, I think my biggest regret is like I didn't capitalize on my fame as much as I could have. Like, he did say he would never sell his hat or any of his memorabilia, but he has gotten insane offers. He said the craziest offer he had ever gotten was like $100,000 for his hat, but he would never sell it because he's like, it means so much to me. And that guy who's drunk offering me $100,000 for my hat, like you can just rip it up tomorrow and it doesn't mean anything to him. And I'm like, and overall, I got a very good taste of him as a person. And he said it's ironic because he's like, I'm the total opposite of Scumbag Steve deep down. Like I pride myself on being a good person, and a meme about me being this horrible like douchebag character came about, which he thought was really like, that's like, he's like, that's the most ironic part about Scumbag Steve, is that's just not who I am. But yeah, no, like he's even said, he's like, he wishes he capitalized on it. The only other person other than Haley Welch that might have been able to like encapsulate what she did, where you get a manager immediately and you do all these crazy things immediately, was probably Bad Baby. She went a very different route. Like she made an OnlyFans like when she turned 18, and it's not something I would support, at least not my daughter doing. But like comparatively, I would say both of them are like the only people where they were a meme and they didn't like let it get to their heads, and they said, and they actually thought objectively about it and said, no, I could really make money off this without being over the top and obnoxious, and just like meeting a few people and getting a manager and yeah,
Yeah,
just
you're
making a name for
talking about the
myself.
Catch Me Outside girl, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and she got into music a little bit. She done like a music album, or I don't know, she done an album. I
Yeah,
know she.
Gucci flip flops. Gucci flip
Yeah,
flops.
I'll be honest with you, it wasn't the worst thing I'd ever heard. You know, if I'm being 100% honest, I've heard a lot worse, like especially with rap nowadays. You know, it's not in my playlist, but it wasn't the worst thing I'd ever heard. And you're right, she had the OnlyFans set up, but I think that was more or less of like, all right, I got one shot to get this payday, at least for this. You know, she had other things she could do, obviously. I mean, people like that get paid to make appearances at clubs and stuff like that. It's a whole different dynamic when you become that internet sensation, because clubs will pay you literally to show up, post on Instagram, went to club so and so, had a great time. You guys should check it out. There's big money in that. You wouldn't think so, but there's big money in that. And all you literally have to do is show up, hang out for a little bit, have some free drinks, and go home. But I think when she realized the 18 was coming, she built up that hype that, hey, my OnlyFans is going to drop. And I'm like, even if they just do 1 month, I think she was like, I forgot how many, 80 million or so. It was
She
something.
made like 1 million, I think, 13 hours. I think that was because I remember my friend calling me one day, or I was calling my friend one day. We were talking, and we're talking about like the insane ways that people have made money, and I've heard all of them at this point, and the amount of money, because he's like, dude, like if the 13 hours she made $1 million just on the fact that she was just gonna have a sex tape posted. And I mean, you can make the same argument about Kim Kardashian. Like, she also capitalized on that unfortunate fame of being like having her sex tape posted, or
I don't even think Bad Batty had a sex tape. I think it was just like pictures, and I don't even know if it was like full nudity or anything like that. I think they were like, I don't know if I'm not a subscriber, so I can't tell you. I didn't see them, but I don't think it was like total like X-rated. I think it was still a little, I guess, classy, I guess would be the word if you want to throw that in there. Tasteful,
Yeah.
I guess, you know?
Yeah, I mean, whatever term you want to put on it. It wasn't hardcore. It was
hard. That would be the better way to put it. Yeah, that's a better word. Wasn't hardcore. So it's like you still got a little respectability there. And then, like you said, you have to also think too, even this, like podcasting, our jobs, what's the next episode? You got to think, if you're going to go that route, I'm not condoning that, but like, if you go hardcore all out with your first post, you got to think I got to up that every time. Whereas if you start out with something a little bit revealing, a little bit more revealing, then that can kind of build up and get you more followers, more subs, stay longer. So anything in life, whether it's podcasting, job, OnlyFans creation, like you gotta have to think long term, and like you said, capitalize when you can. Matt Cox told me that the first conversation we had, he said, I missed my window to really blow up, because he said, I should have done a channel immediately after Danny's show when it blew up, and I didn't. I waited a while, and by then the heat had kind of wore off and nobody knew where to find me. And he says that a lot of people know where to find him, but like, cause he had other things too. He had the LifeLock, and then he was on American Greed, no episode about him. So he still had a name value, but I understood what he meant. Like, he had a window there to really capitalize. And I think no matter what it is, if it's for a stupid reason or whatever the case may be, if you're lucky enough to catch that lightning in a bottle, that don't happen to everybody, and it don't happen often. So you have to grab it and seize it. Even if it ain't for 15 minutes of fame, you got to grab it.
Yeah. So with Matt Cox, and I have two things. So Matt Cox, with him, I remember I asked him like, what, like, because I first was introduced to him years ago as a kid. Like, I remember hearing his name. Actually, I think, what was the first time I knew about him? I think there was two introductions to him, vaguely, like vague. Like, I kind of saw him on shows, and I think the first one was Patrick Bet David. And he actually said the first show that he did was Danny Jones, and then secondly Patrick Bet David. But I think the more noteworthy one of the two, at least in my opinion, was probably Patrick Bet David, because that's like a super wealthy businessman who has a podcast, who doesn't just interview nobodies. Like, he interviews really big people, and he's over here interviewing this guy. And that's where I think I got my introduction to him. And also I think there was like a LifeLock commercial. And I remember seeing that as like on TV as a little kid. And that was it. Like, I remember seeing that, and that's how I knew of him from then on. And then, you know, when I had him on my show, I'm like, oh, this guy really exists. Like, you know, but going to more about your content. So, and also we're talking about like porn stars and OnlyFans girls. So you've interviewed quite a few porn stars,
Yeah.
and OnlyFans girls. So I got to ask,
Mhm.
why? Like, cause for me, and this isn't anything against you. It's just like, I would never, not never. I shouldn't say never. I don't see what they're going to tell me that's like that interesting for me.
Right. I mean, it's definitely not for everybody, but and I don't like to inject too much of my, stuff when I have a guest on, but you talked earlier about a change in branding. Originally my idea when I was going to start a podcast, it was around COVID, and I had some friends that were strippers locally, and they were talking about how COVID affected them. Like, because you got to think, that's how those girls made their living, whether you agree with it or not. That's how they made their living. Um, and so when the club shut down, that's no income. You can't exactly claim unemployment, working with there. A lot of that stuff, some of these girls are even doing it like totally on the table, cash business. So it really created like a panic. But then you had OnlyFans that come out around that same time. So it allowed these girls to work, still make money, but do it from the confines of their own home. And so it kind of supplemented the income. Some girls were doing so good at it, they didn't even go back to the clubs when everything reopened. But in the beginning, I was like, this is a really interesting concept of how these people are dealing with it. And I had a name picked out and everything. I still got the email for Gmail. I was going to call it United Sex of America. And that was going to be the one. And I was like, I was going to interview, strippers and sex workers and kind of have somewhat of a soft white underbelly feel, but focus in on like, all right, how this has affected you. What did you do to change it? Because it's like a business model, but just in a very, different industry than people are used to. But then, like I said, I had to forward thinking. I'm like, all right, how many of these girls? I know 2 girls that work here locally, but who else do I know? How else am I going to get all these people? So I always had like I guess a desire to interview people from that industry, but I just knew I couldn't make the whole show about it. And then piece by piece here and there, just from connections, I've had a lot of people, that's come on the show. I've got a buddy of mine named Ivan. He's a adult film director, director, Hall of Fame director. They have a Hall of Fame just like everybody else. Nicest guy you would ever meet. Like, does a lot of stuff for the girls, helps the girls out. And a lot of times the girls that get in there into this industry are struggling. So that's their answer financially. I'm not saying every one of them, but a lot of times that is the case. And like, he helps these girls, he builds them up, he gives them profiles, he takes pictures, he really helps kind of find them a home. And a lot of the girls that he has under his, I think it's Alterotic, are like heavily tattooed. And you would think like the porn industry is something that they would say, you're not going to get, cast aside or ostracized because of what you have on your body. You're shooting adult films. But a lot of times, if you got tattoos, they don't even want to touch you. And so even in that industry, there's like standards. And it's just, they have really interesting stories. And it's not, I know it's not for everybody, but I find them interesting. Some of the best people I've talked to have been from, that industry, either the dancing side of it or whatever. And, I think that's another thing too, especially when girls that have done like, sex work, when you get into what people really like in their private life, obviously they don't name drop, but they just talk about experiences. People are just into weird stuff. And, my thing is, as long as it's not illegal, do whatever makes you happy. But it's just, I always psychologically, it always interested me into what makes people tick, what makes people, do this, do that. How do you get there? How does it go from what's normal to regular people to what you consider something pleasurable? And so that's kind of the mindset that I go into, because it's, if you actually listen to a lot of these interviews, and I'm not saying that you haven't, but people say, oh, you interview a porn star. I'm like, yeah, but listen to the interview. Like, we don't sit there and talk about childish shit. Like, we actually talk about like interesting conversations. Why that, obviously we cover why they got into it, but it's like, it's intellectual. And I tell people, I'm like, listen to them before you listen to other ones, because you'll have a different outlook on it. We talk about it from the business standpoint. I had Ryan Connor on, who's like a legend in the business. And there was like an AIDS scare back when she was doing it. And we talked about that, how a guy was having, flings outside of the industry, because people, I think, assume because someone's in that industry, they would just, I would be able to go up to them and say, hey, let's go do this. And they're just going to do it. And they're like, that's the last thing we want to do. We do it all the time. That's our job. Like, we don't want, it's the exact opposite of what people think. So getting that psychology was really what kind of drove me to have those guests on.
Yeah, the porn, like the porn industry in general, and like the adult content industry, not that I've ever consumed it, is a very unique means of existing, because it feels like, I don't know how to explain it. It doesn't feel like a normal business at all, because the way, like, it feels almost like an underground business, but it's not. Like, in a way it is, but it isn't, because it's perfectly legal to consume pornography as long as it is not somebody that is a minor or non-consensual. But at the same time, the way that like the companies are set up and the way it's like super underground, like nobody wants to like own up to it or like admit what they know. And like there's been there's just some of it's like really, really disgusting. Like for me, I'm very against pornography, because I think that it's not good for the minds of anybody involved. I don't think it's good for mental health. I think it kind of, we get into the argument that it trains men to objectify women, and vice versa too, but more so men to women. And we can get into all those arguments, which are all true. I don't think there is any advantages to pornography, at least for me. Like, I'm not, I don't think I learn anything from watching the film. Not that I ever have, but in general, I just don't think that it's a good thing for society. I think if I had to like weigh out the benefits versus the negatives versus pornography, I would probably say there's like an infinitely more negatives. But I'm glad that you're not sitting here talking about, very trivial things when it comes to those sorts of people. Like, you're not talking about things that are, I'll put it to you this way. On other podcasts, they're not going to be talking about the why and like, the where did this come from? Why would you be motivated to make money this way? Most people are more interested in, what's the biggest blank that you've ever blanked?
Yeah.
Right. I'll put it to you that way. Or what's the weirdest blank that you've ever had to shoot? What's the weirdest scene you've ever had to shoot? Or what's the weirdest request that you've ever gotten? I mean, I'm sure you've asked that too, and that's fine. But
variations of that, sure. But I think that's one reason, honestly, why the girls like coming on my show, is because it's probably so driven in every other thing that they do. Like, we talk about horror movies, a lot of it's like a trend. Everybody in that industry loves horror movies. So we'll spend a period of time talking about that. And every one of them, I ain't say everyone, but the majority will say, like, I really enjoy doing your show because you don't ask the same stupid, immature, childish questions that other podcasts ask.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you don't, because it's so boring listening to those sorts of interviews. Like, I know the Nelk Boys do those interviews. Like, I know they did one with like a Bella Danger, who I didn't actually know who she was until I actually looked her up, and then I'm like, I gotta go figure. Like, this is very on brand for them. So, every time it's just like, dude, like, that's so insane. I'm like, there's nothing crazy happening. Like, it's nothing you haven't heard before. Like, she has sex on camera. It's just a very, okay, so what? Like, you have to like work a little bit harder. I feel like for me, I would have to work a little bit harder to make that interesting. Or if I would have to take it from a very different approach, because another thing too is also with OnlyFans girls, most people don't know this or don't understand this, which is that so many of them go on shows just because they're going to get promotion out of it. And like, it's, I don't know if that's a known thing. Like, it's something that I had to kind of like, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I've had to like kind of discover this myself. And like, it's just insane. Like, the amount of money that these people make. It really is. I remember Corinna Kopf, best friends with David Dobrik. And she was showing him, there's a video where she's showing David takes her phone and like, he's like, guys, this is disgusting. Like, look at how much money she's making. And it's just $300,000 a month or something ridiculous. And that's a normal amount of money for those types of people. Like, at least in the higher end. On the lower end, $5,000 a month, even on a small scale. Like, you'd be surprised. There's a girl on BuzzFeed who, if you look up like how my feet made me famous, and people started paying her for, pictures of her feet, basically, because she was in a video and then people started offering her money. She never did accept that money. She never actually got into OnlyFans or any of that type of stuff. Maybe she did. I don't know. It's just on the down low. But she told her story about how she got known because of that. And she talked about how one guy was offering her $2,000 to like step on like a bunch of eggs, like raw eggs and stuff like that. You could watch it. It's like a very short video. I mean, it's not that crazy, but then you also get people like James Sexton, who's the divorce lawyer. Do you know who he is?
No.
So, okay, you would like to have him on. So he's a very famous divorce lawyer. James Sexton is his name, and he's based in New York. One of the most famous divorce lawyers of all time. And he talks about how like even old guys will marry like 20-year-old girls, or they'll date them. And there'd be like people with tremendous amounts of money that just do that. And it's like such a common thing that he sees all the time in his office. Like, woman married hedge fund manager who was like worth $500 million and then divorces him, and all of his 30 years of work, and she was just hot. And like, that's what he said. But that, I don't know. It's just a very unique topic that I feel like a lot of people don't truly understand.
Well, and that's why when, if people watch it, I try to bring it from a different perspective. I try to understand, the business model, because I'm like, all right, look, there's no retirement in adult films. What are you doing next? Again, what we've talked about, what's your next move, your next thing, your next brand. And did you ever watch that documentary on Netflix, the Ashley Madison?
No, but I'm very familiar with the story though.
Okay. So it was years ago. It was a website to come out basically to promote people to have an affair. And I didn't even know all this went about. It was taken over by hackers, and they're like, this is,
and they leaked all the information. They blacklisted the CEO. Yeah. I know the story. Yeah.
So when I talk to some of these women, especially girls that do like escorting, I asked them, I'm like, do you feel like you're ruining families by men that are seeing you that are married? And the one girl, she had a very interesting take on it. She said, no. She's like, I'll tell you why. She's like, I have this guy who is married. He loves his wife. He's got kids. He loves his kids. He just has a desire to still be sexually active, and his wife doesn't. So he fulfills that desire with me. And then he has his family life at home that, he's able to, enjoy, get through or whatever, because that desire is filled over here. She's like, so imagine if I didn't do that. He's got to go to clubs. He's got to go, whatever he's got to do, meet people, have affairs at work. Then it becomes like you're doing it with this person, that opens the door for more risk. She's like, he comes to me, he gets what he needs, and he goes home to his wife. She's like, so in a weird way, she said, people may not agree with this, but she's like, I'm really holding that marriage together. Because if I say I'm not going to see you anymore, he has to go through other avenues to do it. Possibly, and I don't know if his wife knew, but, possibly get caught. And, if it worst case, maybe you have a divorce. If he's like, look, I can't do this, I got to go see somebody else. Then you have a divorce. Then the kids have to grow up in a broken home. So like, it makes sense how she worded it. It really does make sense. And that's the kind of psychology that I like to get out of some of these interviews. Cause like you think, how would a man seeing an escort be a good thing? Well, when you lay it out, like I just laid it out, it's not the worst thing if it keeps them together and it keeps kids with both parents in the house, cause if that's gone and the man's like, I got to have it, we got to get a divorce, I got to meet somebody that's, going to fulfill these needs, then it's a broken home. So it's some validity to it.
So, well, there's a couple of things that I was thinking of when you were saying that. So one of them is, what do you know what the two oldest there's two. Most people say there's one. There's two of the oldest professions in the world. Do you know what they are?
One's prostitution. I'm assuming the other one might be gambling.
No, it's so this is historical. Like, this isn't even just like my theory, but this is the fact. Two oldest professions in the world, definitely prostitution. That's the one that everybody knows because that's the saying. The second one is being a mercenary. Oh. So, historically, because I watched the video, it's like, what is the oldest job? It's being a soldier. It's killing. Like, that's basically human nature, that the two oldest jobs in the history of the world that have ever existed were about killing and sex. So,
interesting.
That's an interesting way to look at it. But the second thing was that behavior of, we don't want to, like, my wife and I don't romantically like each other, but we want to stay together. I remember I was watching like BoJack Horseman, right? So this was years ago, but he was having this conversation with his mom because his mom and his dad hated each other, but they always stayed together. And he was saying like, his mom was coming up with like the fact that everybody gets divorced all the time, so it doesn't mean anything, and why would you want to do that? And she goes, I think at one point she finally said, she's like, oh, you spilt this. Like they treat it like a breakup, and then she finally says a really valid reason where she's like, we only want to stay together until the kids are away at college, and then we want a divorce. I want a divorce. Like, and then she says it sarcastically, and he's like, well, no, that's actually a valid reason why you should get a divorce. But so many people, and I think the guy James Sexton, I'm going to go back to because he's like the king of all this. He's the king of like knowing love in and out. But it's like there's so many marriages. So the way that we want marriage to end is in death, right? It either ends in death or divorce. So all marriages will end, but you either die, one of the spouses dies, or you get divorced. And those are the only two ways, right? And in an ideal world, you die together, unfortunately. And that's the only thing like that I can think of where, and he said this, he's like, it's the only thing I can think of where you kind of wanted to either end, you wanted to end in death.
Yeah.
But he talks about how 50% of people divorce. That's a known statistic. Half of all marriages fail. But more specifically, how many of them are miserable? So let's say 50% of them fail, right? Let's say he said like another 20%, that's being conservative, of them are miserable. Of the people that never get divorced. There's so many people that are totally miserable with each other, that can't stand each other. Maybe the spark's not there. Maybe they just like another person more. And it goes on and on. You're divorced yourself, so
No, I'm not divorced.
You're not divorced? No, what about your story though?
No, we're still together. We were in the process of getting the divorce. Everything happened. And so obviously I wasn't spending any more money on a divorce lawyer. That got canceled and we're still together.
Oh, well, God bless. I thought you ended up getting divorced. But I was more interested in the murder, to be quite honest. But
for anybody that don't know my story, they're Googling right now because that went left.
Yeah. But no. So you were in the process, heavily in the process of getting divorced. So you still understand and you can relate to everything I'm saying and everything he said. But there's so many people that will use sex in that way. They will get a prostitute, not because they're lonely, but because they have the urge and their wife just doesn't want to, or maybe just isn't interested, or maybe it's the other way around, or maybe neither of them really like each other and are just staying together because they want to take care of the kids and they like the kids, but they don't like each other. There's all these different reasons. People think that marriage is... I wish people would treat marriage like a little bit more seriously. That's one thing I wish. Like people do treat marriage like it's just a long-term relationship, and they treat divorce like a breakup. There's so many people that do that, especially celebrities. But it's like, you actually look at the vows. What are the vows in marriage? It's like, until death do us part, in sickness and in health and wealth and poverty.
Loving to cherish.
Yeah. You like so many people, the first thought is just, I don't like this guy, I want a divorce. Like, no, like you try everything first and then you get a divorce, and that's like a last resort for me. And unless if you have a prenup, don't go to a divorce. Like, unless if you have something like that set up, don't go to a divorce. Like, so many people don't sign prenups. And to your point about escorts, like justifying it because the guy would cheat anyway on somebody else, that's 100% true. Like, people, those relationships do exist where they're both totally miserable, but they love the kids more. That happens all the time. Is it something I would do? No, but it's a sad picture because you get two people that don't really care for each other anymore.
I'll combat that by saying this. You're saying that that's not something you would do right now, looking at it, relationship wise, but when you grow, I don't want to say grow up, I'm not saying it in that term, but like when you get older and you have kids, you then look at things more of what affects them than you. So you look at it from the context of, this woman may drive me crazy, but I'm going to stick it out because I know in the end it's better for my son or my daughter to grow up in a good home or in a unit. Some people can't do that and they do wind up getting divorced, but it kind of is that point of where you have to look for their benefit as opposed to your own.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I have conflicting beliefs about divorce because And I mean, my parents are not divorced. Like they're finally together. So I'm lucky in that aspect. But I've known many people that have had their parents divorced. I've known people with absent fathers. I've known people with, the whole 9 yards, like dad's a scumbag, this guy's a scumbag, or like, the mom is really manipulative. And I've known all these people. And there are many times when divorce is heavily justified, like on at least one end. So I'm not sitting here saying you can never get divorced no matter what, and only like under one circumstance. Like, no, like there are many times where you may not even agree that you want to divorce each other, but
Just
you
better.
should.
Yeah.
That you should. And I've known people like I have this one uncle. My family's really big. My mom is one of 10. But I have this one uncle and his wife. They got divorced, and they're like best friends. Like they still really love each other. Like as friends, they still like each other, still like hug each other, still have family events together. And there's other people that I've known that have gotten divorced that are like, it's so awkward, and you can feel the tension in the room where they're at a family get together. It's like it's like boys and girls at a middle school dance. It's like you get
That's
one
right.
on one end of the floor and another at the other end, and that's really sad. Like that it had to get to that point.
Yeah. And that's kind of how I grew up. Like my parents got divorced when I was young, but they stayed together. And it definitely wasn't like a loving marriage. Like they were together, I think 100% for, I would say, convenience sake. Right after I graduated, my dad did move out. We've never really had that discussion of did he stay there until I graduated. I've heard that he's told people that. We've never actually had that discussion. Um, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But I think that really too kind of set it in me of like, I want my marriage to be happy because there's very few memories that I can honestly say that I had of my parents being happy together. And that's sad when you think about it. You don't notice it too much when you're a kid. You know something's off, but you don't understand the depth of it. When you get a little older, then it hits home a little more. And like that's a bad way to live. So I think that's a lot of where that comes in out of people sticking it out at least to that point. That's always that point. They say, well, when the kids graduate, I'm out of here. That's the reason they want to stick it out for the kids.
Well, and that's the right thing to do. I think like if you have kids, it's no longer about you. That's the way I see it. It's like second you have kids, psychologically, number one, it's just a fact. Like it's just not about you. You don't think about you as much. Like you start thinking, okay, what's better for my son or my daughter or twins or whatever you have. So yeah, so I do understand that perspective, and I don't know. I mean, I'm not in that scenario. I never have been. I really hope I never do.
Right.
But we can only pray. And you know what? I respect it. Like if that's what you want to do, it's not something I would do, or I don't think I would ever want to do or have to do. But live your life. Like don't that like my thing is always just be like, do the right thing. And if everybody focused on doing the right thing all the time, and when they had an urge to do something bad, they didn't do it, the world would be like a 90% better place. And they also told the truth when they should. Yeah. Or not even white, like even including white lies. Like they were perfectly honest all the time, the world would be a much better place. But unfortunately, we don't live in that world, and we live in a world of a lot of cheaters and scammers.
Unfortunately, we do. And I think that's some of the highlights of the shows. We put out those stories just for people to see, and even someone is the age you are, you're learning. I would think you are more advanced in stories and things that have happened in the world than most people you're going to run across your age because you're into this. And I always had that people would argue with me because I watched horror movies at a young age. I let my son watch horror movies at a young age, and everybody would say, that's too young to let him do that. And I'm like, I don't feel that way. That's my style. And I'm like, if you shelter people from the real world till they're, grown adults, then when you let them loose, reality is going to smack them in the face. I'm not saying throw them out in the middle of the street, but hey, this is a movie. This is this, slowly introduce them. If you keep them so guarded, you're going to run into issues later on when they finally like, oh, I can do this. I can go do this. And it's like, they're going to go buck wild. But if you kind of slowly introduce them, like I tell my son, I'm like, look, me and this guy were great friends growing up. And when we got to this point in life, we separated. He got hooked on drugs. He became homeless, and he was walking down the road drunk one night, and he got hit by a car and he's dead. Like, so it's not always going to have a good ending. And I've decked it up a little bit better than that, but I'm just kind of using that as an example. You let them know that the dangers of it, trying this one time can lead to that. Because when me and that kid hung out at the age he is now, he wasn't like that. He didn't do any of that, but it only took one time. And, you know, some people's personalities are different and they can lead you down a bad path. So I think experience and hearing these stories, like you're going to be so much more aware of different things now because you've heard these stories. You've been exposed to them. You don't have to experience them, but you've heard other people's experience, and that's good enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, and this is also part of the reason I stopped doing like, I don't do the true crime interviews anymore. Is I also think it was starting to like jade my view of people a little bit. Like, it for me it really did. Like, because after a while, I started thinking to myself, dude, the government sucks. The people around me suck. Like, everybody's like out for themselves, and everybody's. And after talking a little bit about it and like thinking about it, and I'm like, well, I wouldn't feel this way if I was interviewing a cancer surgeon. Like, I wouldn't, like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't interview, if I was interviewing people that were doing something great for humanity and the world and mankind, and were really like focused on altruism and helping people, I wouldn't feel that way. So then that's part of the reason why I stopped. Or the big reason actually.
Mm-hmm.
But with that being said, I do think I'm glad I learned it though. I'm not going to be like, oh, I don't want to, like, I can't live with this. Like, no, I can. Like, I'm glad I learned what I learned. And I'm glad that I know what I know. And knowing what I know now about how people are, and, because I've also, which I'll tell you after the show, because I don't want to like talk about specifics here, but there have been people that have not scam. I guess, yeah, like there have been people that have tried scamming me, like, and more than you would think too, and that's a shame.
Yeah.
I'm smart enough to spot it, at least I think.
I've had that happen to me too.
So yeah, I've had people like just try to tell fake stories. I've known people, but there's so many stories I've learned too about how much people are in it for themselves, and how much you really don't know some people. So the one that sticks with me, Barry Minkow. So do you know Barry?
No.
Okay, good dude. And if you look up his name, like the first thing that comes up is like the FBI's website. So he was convicted for a $100 million Ponzi scheme. So this guy had a net worth of $100 million, right, at his peak. And this guy was doing crazy stuff. Like, he was getting, at my age, he built this company called Z Best, which is like a carpet cleaning company. And he was getting loans from the mob, and then he was investing it. And then it got so big to a point where it was listed on the NASDAQ. It's a publicly traded company. And he was on Oprah, and he wrote a book, and then it all came crashing down. Even Mark Cuban actually spoke about reading his book originally, talking about how crazy it was that he scammed all these people and how it changed his life. And they actually spoke eventually. But Barry, when I had him on the show, I asked him, like, what was the most, I think it was like the most meaningful experience of your life, or biggest regret, something like that. And all of them fit because they go under that same category. Because what he said was, he tells me the story where he goes, I remember walking down, I remember being in my house. He's like, I remember being in my house. I'm talking from the perspective of him. I remember being in my house, and I remember seeing one room. There were 3 rooms. He goes, I remember there's one room, and there was an accountant in that room, or a team of accountants that I was paying. Then he goes down to the second room. It's all these mobsters that he owes loans to. Owes loans to. Then there's a third one where it's his best friend who he had just given $5,000. And so then from that moment, he realized all these people that were around him were only there because he was giving them money, with the exception of his wife, who was with him since day one. But then he started realizing, he's like looking back, and he's like, that's just tremendously sad. And I remember another noteworthy story. There's 2 more. So Matt Cox told me a story where he's like, when he did the fraud, right? He went to federal prison. He was in prison for 13 years. And when he got caught, the people that showed up were not the people he was trying to impress with his schemes or the fraud it was the people at his high school. And we got into a discussion where it's like, people don't really think about you as much as you think they do. That's a sad truth. Like, people never will accept that. Many people never, ever accept that. They make fame their entire life. They make attention or prestige. But it's like, at the end of the day, people have the blinders up. Like, people are not thinking about you as much as you like to think. And then the third one was Kyle, the guy who traded between $26 to $2.7 million. I asked him, like, like, why would you go public with this? And how have people treated you differently? And he's like, look, man, I'm my best friend for a third of my life. A third of his life. He's like 30, so it's 10 years, right? And he explained to me, he's like, all of a sudden, second he started going on shows and talk about the money he's made, he started asking him, not for like $20 here and there. No, like $4,000. Like, and then he realized, he's like, this guy's only friends with me now because I've made money. And then he also had guys that were bums that like were reaching out that he knew from high school that were asking for money. But like people really are strange, weird. And, I hate to be that way, that people are terrible, but people can be terrible more often than not.
100%. And I think where we are in society is that's what's, there's a market for what you're saying you want to do. I'm not in no way trying to talk you out of what you're wanting to do, because it sounds like you have a passion for it, of interviewing people that are doing great things, because the world needs people that are doing great things, and the world needs to know about those people. But I think right now in society, the world is fixated on the mad and the macabre. And, you could do a story tomorrow about a guy that, finds out a cure for cancer, but then you could do an in-depth story on Charles Manson. And I think it would triple, quadruple the ratings for Charles Manson, because that's what people are, fixated on and into. And like I tell people, it doesn't mean that you're weird. You're into that kind of thing. And, I've had people accuse me, and they'll say, we know you interview this person, you interview that person. I'm like, look, CNN had Charles Manson on. That don't mean that guy was a serial killer. He wasn't glorifying it. He was doing his job as an interviewer. So I think it's really just, whatever you're trying to put out there, whatever the message is you're trying to send, because you're not glorifying what he did. You're saying, hey, this dude was a sick individual. Like, this guy was a bad dude. You need to, this is the traits that he had. This is how he had people fooled. So it is bringing awareness in a way, but I think as long as you're doing the right thing, man, doing it positive, it's good. And you've talked about a lot of the guests you've had on. I'll be honest, I stay so consumed with my own stuff. I don't have a ton of time to check out a lot of people, but I'm gonna go check out some of the people that you've had. Tell everybody where they can go to find your show and track you down.
YouTube. And Instagram. My Instagram is at GorgP21, GORGP21, and then my YouTube is just my name, George Peyrouton, Peyruton. And and I appreciate that you gave me the chance to truly plug my channel.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, how are we on time? I just want to know what your time limits are.
Oh, I'm good. I want to watch. I don't know when this will air. I want to watch the debate tonight, so as long as it's before then.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, no, I'm good with that. So I appreciate that chance. I was just gonna say too, I also started to realize, I'm like, I do want to interview more positive people. I think that was just my realization. Like, it's maybe, you get guys like Ian Bick, who I think you were on.
Yes.
And if he wants to, if you want to interview a million criminals or CIA guys to talk about their murder stories or, whatever, fine. That's your thing. Like, it's not my thing anymore. Maybe at some point I'll go back to it, and I still can. But like, for me, I don't know if it's the output I want into the world anymore, and or into my own head at least. I also think too, there's some really cool people out there that don't get the chance. And when you're talking about ratings, 100% true, because you get that 15-year-old kid who I actually did reach out to, and he did not respond. Who created the soap Cancer? You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
The cancer soap. Yeah, I reached out to him, didn't respond, sadly. But if he's watching this right now, I really hope he does. But I'm like, that's so cool. And that was only popular for like a week to talk about him. And that's a shame. And then you get like, and we can talk about, but that guy got famous for this. Why do we make stupid people famous? No, it's not even that. It's that we don't make good people famous. Like, it's not that we make stupid people famous. Making stupid people famous is one thing. Problem is that we make only stupid people famous. If there were stupid people and then like a lot of good people that were famous, that's fine. Like, if you want to make, whoever, Bad Baby famous, that's fine. That's your prerogative. I don't really care. I don't keep up with her. I don't follow her. It's not my interest. But what are we doing? Like, there's people that are curing cancer at 15 that are making all these cool soaps and chemicals that are curing diseases, and we're not going to talk about that. And it's only cool to talk about it for a week. I don't know. I feel like that's just a disservice more than anything.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, man, you got to answer to yourself when you wake up. Is this the, what I want to be putting out, and that's why, like, I never wanted to get boxed into one thing. That's why I strayed away from, the sex working podcast originally. Then I was going to go true crime. And then I was like, well, I want to talk about a lot of stuff, man. I want to talk about wrestling or movies or whatever else. And my buddy actually kind of gave the name to the show. He's like, so you want to do crime and entertainment? I'm like, that's actually a pretty cool name. And it's so like vast. It's got a huge umbrella. So you can cover, actors and actresses and TV stars, movie stars, people that have had fraud or people that have been wrongfully convicted or, writers. It's the smorgasbord of whatever you really want to do. It doesn't put you in a box. So I'm able to bounce around a little bit. I think that keeps it fresh. And, it's really what does it for you. Like I had a guy on not too long ago. His name was Keith Coogan. He was an actor from the 80s. Back in my day, I grew up watching him in a movie called Adventures in Babysitting, and then Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, and Toy Soldiers. And so like he was a part of my childhood growing up. I was able to interview him and ask him those questions. I'm pretty sure not a lot of people that, watch my show probably found it interesting. Some did. It had its niche, but it wasn't definitely one of my most famous ones, but I loved it because it was like, it resonated with me because he's one of the guys that I watched coming up. So I got to hear a lot of cool stories about, the set and what went on and all that. And it was very interesting to me. And at the end of the day, if that video makes $2, it was worth way more than that to me to actually get the chance to do it. So at the end of the day, brother, it's all about, what you're enjoying. Cause if you're not enjoying it, then you might as well, stop.
Yeah. So, I'm glad that you said that because I do my interviews like for me now. Like I know what I like and I don't like, and I've said this before, and now I'm doing it all just like the ones that I like, because the ones that I walk away the best from and the happiest that I did, and the ones that I'm looking forward to uploading are always like the famous people, like the influencers, and there are many people that aren't that well known that I've interviewed that made me feel really good. But I really do like interviewing the influencers and the success stories, and those are cool. I was also going to say too, I think the best podcast episode that I've ever watched, and I've watched a lot, it's a really underrated one. I think it's between Michael Stevens from Vsauce and Joe Rogan. I'd recommend that one really highly to anybody because that interview, that whole time, they're going back and forth talking about everything, and it's like just genuine curiosity on both their ends, and it's a really cool interview. And that's one I do want to just say to the audience. I wish that was more talked about as an episode, because between them, those two, and they're like the most curious people you could ever talk about. Like, dude, when they talk, it's awesome. I like that interview, and that's my personal favorite interview or discussion of like any podcast episode of all time. I think out of all the ones I've watched, that one's the one that was most entertaining. I learned enough, and I just really enjoyed it. Michael Stevens from Vsauce on Joe Rogan is the name. But yeah, so to your point though of interviewing people that you want to interview. Yeah, no, I mean, I already said what I've said before, where it's just, you have to, after a certain amount of time, for me at least, I also became more selective, like with who I wanted to interview. And I think that's a necessary amount. That's a necessary thing you have to do after a while.
Yeah. And I hate to make it sound like this, but it's like, in the beginning, to keep guests rolling, I would take anybody, no matter how small of a part it was in a movie, what your role was, if you were a makeup artist or, whatever you were. And I'm not demeaning those jobs by any means. It's a lot cooler than what I do for a living. This isn't my only job. That's why I'm saying that. But like now, I had somebody the other day and they're like, hey, I want to try to get on a movie. And they've done an independent film. And it's like, I wouldn't mind doing it. It's just like, I got to fit it into the schedule because there's a lot of the things. It's like, it's kind of hard to go and have these run a good guests that everybody knows and then fall back to where, somebody that didn't. But at the same time, I want to be a guy that gives somebody like that a break. So it has to make sense. It has to fit. And unfortunately, there's been some that I've had to say, I don't know if it's really going to fit with what I'm doing right now. And, in no way do I ever want to sound like an asshole, but I mean, I've had that told to me before, people just say, hey, your story really don't fit with what I'm doing. So it's a part of the game. I think, rejection or, being denied an opportunity. It's just, I think if you're going to be in this, you have to develop thick skin. People are even going to talk about you if they're going to watch your interview and they're going to come up and, most comments are going to be negative. they're going to say, oh, well, he does this or he does that. And, I think you just have to develop thick skin if you're going to be in this business. But at the same time, I never want to be one that hurts somebody's feelings. So, and especially if they've never done a podcast before, I'm a little weary. Like, can you do it? Because that's not for everybody. Some people get really nervous. Some people, it's just they don't like being on camera. It's like you want to tell your story, but you don't like being on camera. I have had told people no if they didn't want to do video. I'm like, I'm not interviewing a silhouette. I've had to tell them that before.
So yeah, I'm just plugging in my computer. But I was just gonna say that, yeah, that's 100% part of the game. And again, too, I mean, I've gotten no's and I've gotten yeses from some very interesting people. Again, some people that didn't even follow up. But, when I started very recently, too, like I said, with being selective and starting to say no to people more and knowing when to say no to people and sometimes turning down guests and so on and so forth. Like, I've gotten interesting offers, but I also have to turn down because I'm like, I don't interview true crime people anymore. Mm-hmm. And and it's nothing outlandish. I'm not like getting offered $1 million to interview somebody, but
you can always send them to Crime and Entertainment.
Yeah, 100%. Well, you probably already know some of these people, anyways.
Probably.
But it's interesting because I used to be under the impression that I had to say yes to everybody on my show, where I had to be like, because it went from I have to be these really high up guests and it can't be anybody else but. And then it went down to like, just everybody that was part of the Secret Service, people that were in the Army, random professor, cop here in New York. And, again, not talking down to these people at all. I have respect for all of them. And they've done jobs that are much harder than I could ever do or would want to do. But it just wasn't my thing anymore. Yeah. And, to go forward from that topic, what do you think your favorite interview was?
I like how you kind of phrased one. You had a favorite interview and a favorite discussion. I think my favorite interview that I ever did was the Michael Thompson interview that I did. The guy that spent, so much time in prison and was with the Aryan Brotherhood. I think as an interviewer, I think that one was some of my best work. I think as discussion wise, I think me and Tom Sizemore probably had the best discussions. Like I asked him questions, but like we went off and we were the first part of the interview, the first segment is part 1 and part 2 was probably geared more towards his career in movies. The second one, I mean, we were talking about, the landscape of what was going on at the time, which was the Kyle Rittenhouse situation. He was about to go to trial, the Ahmaud Arbery situation. We talked about, obviously the COVID-19 shots. A lot of the actors had to get them, were forced to get them if they wanted to keep working. I mean, we just kind of bounced around here and there. We talked about him playing the role of John Gotti in Robert De Niro's movie. We talked about him working with Spielberg and Michael Mann and, was Oliver Stone, I think it was, that did Natural Born Killers. And he went into a lot of about his drug use and how like, he's like, when you're on a set like that, you're on a high. And he's like, then when it's over as an actor, you might not work for 4 months. So what do you do to kind of keep that high going? You go to a drug that'll give you that high. And, but then when the movie comes back, he said, I could shut it off and go and give 110%. But when it was over, then, it's bad. And gradually, you can only do that for so long, I think. And he was very open about that. And, he was, it happened to be around Thanksgiving and, I was on house arrest, so I couldn't go anywhere. And he's like, you home alone? And I wound up kind of telling him the story off camera because I wasn't allowed to talk about it back then. But, it was just like, we were just friends. And at the end of his interview, and it's one of the things that I'll never forget, because like I said, he sadly passed away. At the end, when he wrapped up the interview, he said, Wade, he's like, I want to thank you for, asking me to come on. He's like, I don't really like talking to people. And he said, I don't really like doing interviews. He said, even though I'm an actor, he said, I'm not very comfortable on camera and I don't like talking to people, but he's like, you've made this fun. And he's like, I really, really enjoyed it. And he's like, keep in touch. And we would text, every blue moon. I've got a lot of people's numbers in my phone that would probably shock people, but I feel like I'm good about handling it. Like I don't text somebody every week. I don't blow them up. I don't send them stupid memes every day. Like if I know it's their birthday, I might shoot them a happy birthday text. Merry Christmas, Happy Thanksgiving. And if it's something that's, I think we could work on or do, I'll send a message. But for the by and large, I don't really bother people. But just to be able to say I've texted with Tom Sizemore and I interviewed him, that was probably the best conversation I think I've had. And then again, that's not knocking any of the other ones. I think I looked the other day, I'm close to 400 videos on the channel. So that's a lot of conversations. And interestingly enough, I've interviewed quite a few people that have passed away, him being one of them. And that's even surreal to know that you've spent time talking with someone that is, no longer with us. And you get a lot of different experiences. So I'm not degrading any of the other shows by any means, but those are definitely two that stick out.
Yeah, one thing we're talking about, like reaching out to people and being friends, like there's one guy who, again, I'm also not gonna say this guy's name, but like there's even a few where I reach out to some of these people, like friendly, um, and I'm trying to think. So on my first episode, that's what I was gonna get at. My first episode, I don't think I've ever said this before. Maybe it's on, I think part of it's on camera, but I don't think the rest of it is. So at the end of the interview, my first interview, and this is, I think, one of the big reasons why I kept going, which I didn't realize until very recently. So the guy Improvement Pill, who I had on with him, the thing that he said to me at the end of the show was, "Hey, this is one of the better podcasts I've been on, one of the best podcasts I've been on." And that was my first ever episode or interview ever. And he goes, "This is one of the better podcasts I've been on because you're actually giving me your input. You're doing this." And I'm like, wait. And I'm like, and I don't think it set in like at that time. But then I thought to myself later on, I'm like, this is a guy who I watched in like 6th grade for like advice on like very basic things. And I'm interviewing him. And like when the first 20 minutes had happened, it didn't feel like it was him. And I'm like, wait, I'm talking to him. Like, that's cool.
Yeah.
But when he said to me, like, yeah, you're really good at this. I think in a weird way, like that might have actually been one of the big ways that I one of the big reasons I continued, because I'm like, this guy liked my show. Like maybe I didn't even realize it. I don't think I did. And that goes into the topic of like good people and like being a good person as much as you can. Mm-hmm. You don't know what you say or how what you say will affect somebody.
Yeah.
Right. So, you might even make a joke in passing, and that could really hurt a person for the next couple of years. Like it's happened to all of us. Like somebody says something and then it really sticks with you in a way that you maybe didn't want it to, or somebody says something really nice in passing that really sticks with you that you don't want to let go of. I mean, like I've kept letters and like notes from people where it's like they would just say it to me and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, George, like, this is like I remember this one time. This is a funny story. So in like Freshman Focus, which is like this course for freshmen basically to understand the high school. Mm-hmm. I remember we got this like note activity, and like you basically would write down your name, and then you would circle around the room this like note, and everyone would have to write down something nice about you, right? And like I still kept it. I'm not gonna say what's on it, but like I kept it because I'm like, this is really cool. Like I really liked that, just because some of the things that they were said, like, yeah, there was a lot of joke things like, "Oh, George, you're so hot." Like, I got that too from my buddies. Like, "George, I have a crush on you. Your secret admirer," stuff like that. But there was a few in there that were real, and I'm like, I felt really good about those. Like, and it also made me feel good with the joke ones too, because like, okay, like I know my buddies are like always having a good time, but
well, it makes you feel good when especially when someone that you consider like a high-end guest or someone that you have a lot of respect and admiration for, when they compliment you back on what you're doing that you don't even really consider like your craft because you're just getting into it. It's a huge impact. Like when I'd been in the game a little bit, but Sizemore was like my first big name guy, like that had been an A-list box office smash movie. So I was a little nervous, and then to actually have that him pay me that compliment at the end, it was like, wow, maybe I am decent at this, because I'd watched other interviews and I never heard him say that on any other interviews. Because that's why I was like, well, maybe he's like, the guy that says that on all the interviews at the end. "Oh, you're the best one I ever been on," and I'd never say this, who this is, but it's a pretty famous YouTube channel, and everybody that I know that's been on that YouTube channel says the same exact story to me when they're talking about the host. They go, he said I was the most interesting guest he'd ever had. You believe that? Out of all his people. And I'm just like, this seems to be a common damn theme. And
Would I know this person?
Oh yeah, everybody would.
I'm just thinking of like, I mean, would you be okay with telling me after the show or no? I mean, I don't care if you.
I'll tell you after the show, 100%. I don't want to possibly ruin a guest appearance and somewhere down the line. So I'll say it after.
Okay, fair enough.
I'll definitely share it. But everybody that I've talked to, there's quite a few people that have been on there. It's yeah, he said it was the most interesting guest he'd ever had, and I'm just like, one of the guys told me that I was like, I almost finished the sentence before he said, he's like, you know what he told me, and I'm like, that you're the most interesting guest you ever had. But I didn't. Yeah. I just let him tell me. I didn't want to ruin the story because I know that had to feel good, for him. And maybe that is a thing to boost up the guest and get him in a good mind space or something, something along those lines. So I'm not knocking it, but you hear enough, you stay in the circle long enough, you hear stories like that.
Yeah, I've heard some interesting stories about people like that too. And I can't even get into all of them because some of them are like very personal. Others like, because like sometimes I've even gotten messages back where like I would message somebody for an interview and they'd say yes. And this is like big YouTubers, like again, going back to like the 5 million plus, 2 million plus categories. And they tell me like, hey man, like I'm not in a good headspace right now. I don't, and like these are people that have been like publicly admitted that they've had issues as well. So it's like when they're telling you that, it's like, oh wait, this is real. Like this isn't like just something that they do. And I actually did recently ask that person how they were. They never responded back to me, but I also wished him a Merry Christmas. So like I do try and keep in touch with those people as well. I'm not like, okay, you like be gone with you. Because I do to some extent care. Like I do at least want them to do well. Yeah. I don't,
And I've had that experience with some guests, like some, it was a podcast. It was kind of like a business deal or whatever, however you want to look at it. And, you might not keep in touch. Obviously some have, blossomed great friendships out of it. Like I'm really close to Matt now. I flew down there. I stayed at his house, him and his wife, was gracious enough to let me stay there, took me out to eat, wouldn't let me pay for a thing. I tried to, and, they were just, really, really great people. People might have their opinions on him because of what he did in his past, but I mean, like, that's not what he's doing now. He's, he's doing the right thing. He's doing it the right way, and he's good at it. And he was the first show that I ever went on to tell my story. And I told him about what happened, and he was one of the first people I talked to. And he's like, bro, you got to come down there and tell it. And like, he didn't have to, after I'd done that story, like there was really no reason for him to stay in contact with me after that. He could have kept on moving. And especially like, that's his job. So it's, me, I get people when I can, but I have a day job. He has to keep interviewing people. So it's like, how much time does he really have to go back and revert and check in with people? But he did. He stayed in contact. He would text, and he would, we would text, back and forth. And he's helped me out tremendously throughout my podcast career with advice and technical issues and, computers and backgrounds. I mean, he kept telling me, he's like, you got to change that background. You got to give something to add some pop. And, it's just funny. I'll do something. I was like, hey, I did it. And he's like, well, if you listened 10 months ago, it would have helped out. And I mean, but he says it in a joking way. And, I owe him a lot for helping me out with everything that I've accomplished here.
Well, Matt, with him, it's really cool because like there's been guests on my show that have been on also Matt's show, not even you, but like just other people. And like they would call Matt and they'd be like, oh, you know this guy George, like, and he'd be like, yeah, you should go on a show. Like he's cool. And I'm like, oh, he feels that way.
He told me that too. I asked him about you because when I seen you pop up in my friend request, I think it was like in Facebook, and I looked and like start with like, and don't take any offense, it looked like one of those bit miner pages, like people.
Right. Yeah. Because I'm sitting in a Lamborghini. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I'm like, all right, they got this young kid sitting on a fucking $200,000 car. Like, what the hell is this? And then I actually clicked on the profile and I seen you were on Danny, and I was like, wait a minute. So I just happened to be communicating.
No, not on Danny. I've yet to go on Danny.
No, not Danny.
I interviewed Julian. I was in his studio, so I wasn't on his show, but I did.
Well, that's
using
what
it. Yeah.
And I reached out to Matt, and I'm like, who is this kid? And he's like, who are you talking about? And I'm like, George Pay, and because I think on the face it's just PEY. And he's like, oh, that's, he started telling me, he's like, yeah, he's a good kid. He's like, he wants to interview you. And I was like, yeah. He's like, yeah, you should definitely go on a show. He's good.
Yeah.
And then I was like, all right, I'm going to interview him too after it was over. So yeah, he talked good about you.
Yeah, no, I actually didn't know, like, he felt like that, like good about me too, about my show. Cause like when after the first impression, I thought like, okay, like he just liked my show, like, you know, and you go about your day. But then like when I heard that people were calling him, because there was like multiple people too that called him, they were like, hey, like, do you think I should do this interview? Like, I know he didn't interview with you. And be like, yeah, like, yeah, you should do it. Like, and I'm like, whoa, like, I think the first guy that told me was James Catledge. He told me that. I don't know if it was off the air or not. I mean, it's not that big a deal if I'm saying that. I don't think he's going to care.
Yeah.
But I think Barry also called him, and he's like, oh, "I'm so glad Matt told me to do this show." And I'm like, I this became a common thing where Matt would recommend me, and I'm like, "That's awesome!" Like, you know, that's and I didn't even know. It's not like he texted me. He's like, "Yeah, I just did you a favor." Like he did it completely in private, unbeknownst to me. That's cool. I like that. That's a real genuine thing. Like for a man who made a career out of lying for like so many years of his life, that's a really genuine act. And I think that's a good place to end off. I think on the recording. I think that's a good.
And I'll be honest with you, like going into this, I was expecting, 45 minutes to an hour, and we went almost 2, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. We've had great conversations.
Likewise.
We've bounced around a little bit. I think it's very interesting for people to hear. And the fact that I've had this 2-hour podcast and I've stayed invested and, in it the whole time, and you're 17.
Yeah, I know. I try not to tell people that because I don't want that to be the reason why people come on my show.
Well, I would have had you on anyway, but it's just the fact that, like, I don't even really know how to put this into words, but like, I think you're going to do great things because you're already this far advanced down the line. Most people can't hold a conversation like you have with the intelligence level that you have for 17. It's just, and I hate to keep harping on that, but it's just a fact. And, I wish you nothing but the best going forward, man. We're going to put a link to your podcast down in the show notes. We're also tag your Instagram. And, have a good night, brother. We'll definitely stay in touch. I definitely want to get some of your guests, so we'll keep in touch. And if there's anybody, off mine that I've had that I can help you out with, we'll help each other out. That's what it's all about.
All right. So you're going to stop recording. We'll talk after the show?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Hollywood Wade. That was George. We'll see you later on. Thank you for coming by, buddy.
No problem, man. Anytime. Have a good one.